Before we begin, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Mr. Chibs, and I review stuff that gets me fired up.
How you doing? And welcome to my Galion TS120 experience. Now, this is a special one for me because it's the first tube amplifier that I've had the pleasure of demoing in my home. Now, don't get me wrong, I've checked out other tube amps before, but they weren't with my speakers and my equipment in my own natural habitat.
Full disclosure, this unit was sent from Galion Audio. I don't get to keep it, and no money was exchanged for the review. Furthermore, Galion Audio does not get to see this review before it goes live, and all opinions are that of my own.
So yeah, this is my first real trip with tubes. The Galion TS120 is a collaboration between the company's founder Thomas and Dodge Audio. You probably already know Thomas from his YouTube channel, Thomas in Stereo. I'll link it below. One thing you have to understand is the TS120 is a lot of amp. It offers Class A or Class AB operation, tone controls, auto biasing, subwoofer out, home theater bypass, and the list continues. As far as integrated tube amplifiers go, this is an incredibly versatile piece of kit, but is it any good? The model I have here today is the TS120 Standard Edition in silver. It also comes in black. It retails for $34.95 USD, and this includes shipping and any custom fees. So let's start with what you get in the box.
You get the unit itself, the tubes, which include two 12AX7s and two 12AT7s. You also get four KT88C tubes, a power cable, a remote control, a quick start guide, and you also get a manual. I'm going to quickly go through my setup. Now, since this is single-ended, you're going to need RCA cables coming from your DAC. I'm using AudioQuest Cinnamon cables here. You have 5 inputs, which is an impressive amount. Now, whether you plug the positive end into 4 or 8 ohms will depend entirely on your speakers. I looked mine up, and 8 ohms was advised. If you have any ground noise, there's a switch to mitigate this. If you're going to be using a subwoofer, you can set the output to either stereo or mono.
That's it. Now we're ready to turn it on and start warming up those tubes.
Now switch it on from standby and you'll hear what sounds like a ping from an incandescent light bulb. The glow you get from those vacuum tubes serves as a nice focal point and deserves to be front and center in my opinion. Just total eye candy. So, you guys ready to get down and listen to some sweet, sweet tubey music? Nope, because now we need to go through the auto biasing process. Once your TS120 has been on and warmed up for 15 minutes, click on the change button to start the process. All 4 power tube LED lights will light up. Click on the bias button. Tube LEDs 1 to 4 will alternate between red and blue, but eventually all LEDs will be consistently blue. This can take a while. Once the bias process is complete, the bias LED will turn off automatically. Once that happens, click on the change button to complete the bias process, and that's it. You'll need to go through the auto biasing process in the following scenarios. Every 3 months, whenever you switch the class of amplification, like from class A to class AB or vice versa, whenever you change tubes. And probably the most important thing, don't ever feed him after midnight. Yum, yum. Now that the TS120 is properly set up, let's get into some listening impressions. This first track by Pepe Romero sounded great. The stomping and snapping sounded like I'm in an open gymnasium. The guitar sounds really warm, and I think to myself, this has got to be the Tubes influence, right?
Now, this was my first holy crap jaw drop moment. This track serendipitously comes on through Rune, almost as if Rune somehow knew that it would be so ideal. It's called Poem of Chinese Drum, and it totally brought me back to a Kodo Drummers concert that I went to in the 90s. Just really tribal. The bass is just phenomenal here. It sounds like I'm uncomfortably close to the stage. Holy Shinto! I can feel the skin of the drums getting beaten, almost as if murder was the intent. In our initial meeting, Thomas spoke about the bass that TS120 delivered, and yeah, it's definitely a thing. I'm literally gobsmacked with its power, and there are no subwoofers connected here. Are you freaking kidding me?
Africa by Toto. Man, this was so overplayed when I was a kid, but never like this. Mid-range is so smooth, highs are sparkling, and the soundstage is impressively wide and deep too. To my surprise, this track is pretty faceted with lots going on that I could actually focus towards. I guess I'm not sick of it anymore. Here and Now is a really cool track I recommend you guys to try out. At one point, the female vocalist's voice melts with the clarinet in such a way that it's tough to discern where one begins and one ends. It's so subtle and freaking cool. I'm having the best time with this Galion TS120. I keep wanting to turn it off just so I can get some stuff done, but then the next song comes on and tempts me to stick around for 5 more minutes. Hey, it's me. I'm not so great at actually getting stuff done. I really need to practice the art of hitting pause right at the end of the song. I'll end the first round of impressions here though, because we should also discuss the Galion in Class AB mode. Now, how does that differ from Class A? Class AB gives you 50 watts per channel over Class A's 30 watts. Now, I know my Cornwell 4s don't necessarily need that extra power, but I still wanted to see how this would influence the sound. So I took an album I'm very familiar with and just went back and forth through the classes. Giorgio had less slam and more balance in Class AB, probably closer to what I'd get from my Hegel integrated. It was sweeter sounding, but definitely sounded like I was using a different amp. I feel like I'm getting more detail in the mids and things were more nuanced, but I was losing a bit of fun in the process. The track Within gave me excellent detail in the highs in Class AB mode. When I switched it to Class A, the piano felt deeper and more lifelike. Overall, though, I preferred it in Class AB. In the track Touch, at around the 5 minute and 50 second mark, there's that stunning bit of synthesizer. The Galion's Class A came out on top here. It just rendered everything better for me in the way that I connected with it. In Get Lucky, Class A has better mid-range here. The clap is more noticeable and the guitar too. Class AB has punchier bass though. The difference is subtle, but I still prefer Class A. It's really cool that you have 2 different presentations in one amp. I also really appreciate the remote in this scenario. Going back and forth and being able to rebias without having to get off the lazy boy is pretty great. So I just listened to the rest of the album in Class A and melted into that lazy boy. Going back and forth A-Bing tends to suck the fun out of the music. It's nice to take a step back from that and appreciate the effing awesome amp I have in front of me. I gotta say, I really enjoyed this album on the Galion. To put it simply, using Class AB is like having a completely different amp. If you end up with your own TS120, I suspect you'll probably dial it down to which class you prefer overall and just leave it there. Now, should you ever want to switch things up, you've definitely got the option.
Now, to further understand this Galion TS120, I decided to A-B against my Hegel H190. No, definitely not an apples-to-apples comparison by any means. And on top of that, my A-B test itself was also flawed. Why? Warm-up time. This is something that you guys should keep in mind. According to the manual, the TS120 takes approximately 20 minutes to reach 80% of its optimal performance. It takes approximately 3 hours to reach maximum smoothness. So since I have to power everything off in order to switch amps, the Galion is at a serious disadvantage here, not sounding optimal. All that aside though, the comparison still gave me a good idea of what the Galion amp does. To add a second set of ears to the mix, I invited my friend Andy, and here's how it went.
So we started with this classical music piece, and both preferred the Galion, more specifically in the way that it renders piano. I found it to sound more lifelike on the TS120, and Andy also said it was crisper. Cathedral by CSNY was a really interesting track to AB. The background hiss is more noticeable on the Galion. The mids are less clear, and the cymbals are less noticeable on the TS120. Bass hits are more pronounced, but not as fast as the Hegel H190. Andy's comments were that the Hegel sounded amazing, and the Galion didn't draw him in the same way, and I can't help but agree. In Blue Rondo a la Turk, Galion takes us round, sort of. Piano sounds deeper and more preferable to both our ears. Andy, however, prefers the way that the saxophone and clarinet's rendered from the Hegel. Alright, Love is a Battlefield by Pat Benatar. We were split on this one. Galion for me takes it. It was just much more fun and sounds almost like it was recorded better somehow. Andy, on the other hand, liked the Hegel better, but wasn't sure why, so he asked me to play it again on the TS120. We switched back and forth again, and to me, Hegel seems more tonally balanced, but just not as much fun. As far as Andy was concerned, Pat's voice sounded better on the Hegel, as well as the percussion instruments. He prefers the Hegel in this case. My wife overheard this whole listening session from upstairs and later asked me why we played that song so much. I was totally embarrassed. It was for science, okay? She hit me with her best shot. Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden. Andy had actually never heard this song before. To be honest, we liked both amps here and couldn't really pick a winner. Andy mentioned the wall of sound that we got in both cases. And finally, we listened to Bad Guy by Billie Eilish. The bass was just crazy on the Galion and so much more fun. Andy said that it drew him in more on the Galion, but he admitted that it may have just been an artifact of him hearing it first on that amp. So even with the Galion being at a disadvantage regarding warm-up times, it totally holds its own against my Class AB solid-state Hegel. Now throughout this whole process, I noticed myself focusing on different things on the TS120 than when I listened to it with the Hegel H190. This was really intriguing and highlights just how nuanced this hobby is.
So let's do a pros and cons list. With that, let's start with the cons, the negatives and nitpicks that I have. So the first one is, like all tube amplifiers, the tubes themselves will eventually wear out and need to be replaced. How often depends entirely on your listening habits though. The larger KT88 tubes are rated at around 2,500 hours, and at the time of this filming, they're about $100 to replace each. So that's $400 US right there. The smaller 12 AT7s and AX7 tubes are cheaper, and they do last longer though, about 10,000 hours. Just keep in mind that this is going to be a recurring cost that you should factor in for down the road should you get any tube amplifier. On to my next negative. Now, according to the manual, you're probably holding it wrong when you pick up the TS120. I'm going to directly quote the manual here. Do not lift the TS120 by the side. The two wood panels are attached with small screws and can break if too much force is applied to them. Lift the unit by holding the front and the back. Now, because the majority of the weight is on the back, this way of lifting is actually really difficult. Whenever you're told how not to lift or hold a product, it's an indication of poor design in my opinion. You guys remember the iPhone 4, the antenna gate with that? People were losing reception and Apple publicly came out and said, "You're holding it wrong." I would suggest redesigning for this shortcoming, or at least using larger screws so this doesn't happen. This thing is 65 pounds and difficult to pick up to begin with. And now on top of that, I have to have lopsided weight on one arm. Now this one is a bit of a nitpick. The tube cage. It doesn't come with the TS120. You have to order it separate. Now, if you have kids or a pet, or let's face it, you're a bit of a klutz, I think buying the extra protective cage is a total must. The tubes are so exposed, I told my kids to not even look at them. And my dog Wolfgang, he wasn't allowed within a 4-foot radius. I've been doing a lot of policing within the last couple months. All right, last nitpick. Having tone controls is a great feature, but they're not accessible from the remote control. Now, while I understand that this would probably add a lot of complexity and definitely extra cost to the amp, I'm spoiled by getting everything done from my listening position. For this reason, I just didn't end up using this feature. Now let's talk positives. And the first one is a big one. It's sound quality. Think rich tubey goodness meets fun, powerful bass. Now add great mid-range and top end to the mix. One thing that I've realized is just how analog and fun the Galion sound signature is. My next pro is it's versatile. I think you would be quite happy with the Galion TS120 at the center of your media room. Between all the input and output connections, you're covered for so many scenarios. The included remote control. Now, the TS120's included remote covers most of what you would want an amplifier to do from your listening position, and I can't tell you how convenient that is. It's also crafted from this really thick and heavy brushed aluminum, so it could also be used in various self-defense scenarios too. Back off, get your own Galion. Yeah, I'd grab this in a self-defense scenario before I'd grab any of my other remotes. Do some damage with this. It's also a great remote. So my last pro is the way that it caters to your sound preferences. So choosing between Class A and Class AB is great if you need more power, but it's also amazing that you get a different sounding amp in the process. On top of that, you've got tone controls should you want to tweak further. So much of this amp is about catering to the listener's various demands, and that's one thing that can't be understated. As it turns out, this tube amplifier is a completely different experience to solid state, and I mean that in a good way. If you haven't demoed one, I think you owe it to yourself to do so in the near future. Now, does it replace my solid state integrated? No, but it complements it though. It produces a different flavor that lends itself to a more enjoyable sound in certain scenarios. In headphone listening, many of us have multiple sets of cans that we use situationally. I'm going to get into this in another video, but I use a different set of headphones for watching TV and movies than I do listening to music, and I'll change headphones depending on which genre of music I'm listening to as well. For loudspeaker listening, I can see the same type of versatility in having different types of amps. A tube amp like the Galion TS120 fits into my system much the same way. So, in the end, I have to admit that I really enjoyed my time with the Galion TS120 and my first in-depth experience with tubes for that matter. If you're like me and you're looking at getting into tube amps, I don't think you can go wrong with the TS120. For its ease of use, its versatility, and the sound quality that those vacuum tubes pump out, all combine for an incredible value in an integrated amplifier. Now, my only hesitation comes from not demoing the $1,000 more expensive premium SE version, something I'd like to rectify in the future. The Galion TS120 gets a big recommendation from this channel, and Thomas will have to take it back from me forcefully. I really do like this amp. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Everybody spends their life trying to keep on getting back, searching but don't know just what we hope to find. I've been over 7 seas, hoping I can find some peace. Tell me, where's this love I hear is so divine? Well, I could never have been ready for back off, get your own Galion.